There are paintings that disturb the viewer, and then there are paintings that seem to violate something deep inside the human mind. Saturn Devouring His Son belongs to that second category. It does not simply show fear, sadness, or violence. It shows something more primal and more unbearable. A father consuming his own child, a god reduced to madness, a dark figure emerging from shadow with wild eyes, and a body caught in the act of destruction. Few images in the history of art strike the viewer with such immediate horror. It feels less like a painting and more like a nightmare that has taken physical form. At first glance, the image is brutally direct. There is no large setting, no comforting background, no decorative narrative frame to soften what we see. Saturn crouches in darkness, gripping the body of his son with terrifying force. His eyes are wide, almost deranged, staring outward as though caught between panic and appetite. The body in his hands is already mutilated. Blood marks the flesh. The act is already underway. This is not a myth presented with elegance or distance. It is violence stripped to its most animal and most disturbing essence. That is one of the reasons the painting remains so unforgettable. It does not allow the viewer the safety of symbolic interpretation before the emotional shock arrives. The horror comes first. Only after that does the mind begin to ask questions. Who is Saturn? Why is he doing this? What kind of world produces an image like this? And why does it still feel so powerful, so modern, and so psychologically terrifying centuries later? To understand the force of the painting, we need to begin with the myth behind it. Saturn is the Roman equivalent of the Greek god Cronus. According to the ancient story, he had overthrown his own father and taken power for himself. But a prophecy warned him that one day he too would be overthrown by one of his children. Terrified of losing control, Saturn decided on a monstrous solution. Each time one of his children was born, he swallowed them. He believed that by consuming them, he could prevent the future itself. He could stop the next generation from rising against him. He could defeat destiny through violence. That myth is already dark, but what makes it especially powerful is the idea beneath it. Saturn is not only a cruel father, he is power devouring his own future. He is afraid so absolute that it destroys what should be loved. He is authority turning monstrous because it cannot bear the thought of replacement, decline, or mortality. The story is not just about family horror. It is about the panic of time, succession, and inevitable loss. Saturn consumes his children because he cannot accept that no ruler remains eternal. Eventually, in the myth, one child escapes. Saturn's wife saves the infant Jupiter by hiding him and giving Saturn a stone wrapped in cloth instead. Jupiter later returns, forces Saturn to release his swallowed children, and defeats him. In many traditional artistic treatments of this subject, the myth is shown with some degree of classical balance. Even when violent, the figures are often idealized. The body may be graceful, the composition may remain noble, the horror may be contained within the language of mythology. But Francisco Goya does something radically different. He tears away the classical distance and leaves only madness, flesh, darkness, and terror. That is where this painting becomes far more than an illustration of an ancient myth. Goya does not paint Saturn as a majestic god carrying out a legendary act. He paints him like a creature of panic and obsession. The body is gaunt, twisted, almost human and inhuman. At once, the face is not calm, not divine, not ceremonially cruel. It is frantic. The eyes bulged with something close to insanity. The entire figure looks as though it has been dragged out of the darkest corner of the mind. We are not looking at myth from a safe historical distance. We are looking at terror made visible. The identity of the artist matters enormously here. Francisco Goya was one of the greatest painters in European art, but he was also one of its darkest witnesses. He lived through war, political violence, repression, illness, and personal suffering. Over the course of his life, his art moved from courtly brilliance and social observation toward increasingly haunting visions of cruelty, nightmare, and disillusionment. By the time he created Saturn Devouring His Son, he was an old man, deeply marked by experience and living in isolation. This was not a painter interested in flattering illusion. This was a painter digging into the most terrifying parts of human existence. The work belongs to Goya's famous group of black paintings, a series of deeply unsettling images that he painted directly onto the walls of his house. That fact alone changes how we think about them. These were not public commissions meant to please a court or decorate a church. They were private, dark, almost secret visions. They emerged from an inward place, from a mind confronting dread, age, violence, and despair. Saturn Devouring His Son feels especially intense because it does not seem made for public approval. It feels like something Goya needed to paint because it was already living inside him. This private quality is one reason the painting feels so psychologically raw. There is no attempt to make the act noble or explanatory. Saturn is alone in darkness. The child is reduced to vulnerable flesh. There are no gods watching, no heavenly symbols clarifying the scene, no elaborate landscape providing mythical context. The viewer is left face to face with a devouring act. The image becomes almost timeless because it has been stripped of anything unnecessary. What remains is fear consuming innocence, power consuming weakness, age consuming youth, time consuming life. That last idea is especially important. Saturn is not only a mythological figure. He has often been linked symbolically with time. In that sense, the painting can be understood not only as a father destroying his son, but as time devouring all things. Youth disappears into age. Life disappears into death. The future is swallowed by the force that created it. Whether or not one reads the painting in that symbolic way, the connection deepens its effect. The image becomes not just monstrous, but universal. It begins to feel like a vision of what existence itself does to everything it creates. And yet the most terrifying aspect of the painting may be its emotional ambiguity. Saturn looks brutal, but also desperate. He appears powerful, yet somehow frightened. There is a sense that he is not calmly in control of the act, but driven by a force he cannot master. It makes him more horrifying, not less. A panicked devourer, destroying out of fear, is another. Goya seems to understand that some of the worst forms of violence do not come from confidence. They come from terror, insecurity, and the inability to toughen what the future threatens to become. The darkness surrounding Saturn intensifies all of this. It is not just background. It feels like a void, a world emptied of meaning, a space in which only this act remains visible. The body emerges from blackness, almost like an apparition. Light does not comfort the scene. It exposes Italiano. The viewer cannot escape into context because context has been swallowed too. All that remains is the act and the stare. That is why Saturn Devouring His Son remains one of the most disturbing paintings ever made. It is not simply violent. It is intimate, psychological, and almost impossible to rationalize away. Goya turns an ancient myth into a vision of madness, fear, and devouring power so intense that it feels less like a story from the past and more like a revelation of something permanent and terrible in human nature. What makes Saturn Devouring His Son so extraordinary is not only the horror of the subject, but the way Goya paints that horror as something almost beyond reason. This is not the violence of battle, where armies clash and motives can be explained through politics, conquest, or survival. This is not even the violence of revenge in the ordinary dramatic sense. It is something more primitive and more psychologically disturbing. A father destroys his own child not because the child has acted, but because of what the child might become. The crime is committed against the future itself. That idea gives the painting enormous symbolic power. Saturn is not just killing. He's trying to prevent time from moving forward. He's trying to devour succession, change, and the threat of replacement. In that sense, the image becomes more than mythological horror. It becomes a vision of power in its most paranoid form. Power often presents itself as stable, rational, and justified. But Goya exposes another truth. At its deepest level, power can be frightened. It can panic at the thought of losing control. It can turn monstrous when faced with the inevitability of decline. Saturn's violence is not triumphant. It is desperate. That despair is visible first in the eyes. Few painted eyes in art history are as unforgettable as Saturn's. They are wide, staring, and almost feral. They do not look calm, divine, or even fully sane. They seem to belong to a being caught between terror and compulsion, as if he himself is horrified by what he is doing and yet unable to stop. This is one of the painting's greatest achievements. Goya does not present Saturn as a simple villain. He presents him as a creature consumed by the very fear that drives him. The devourer is also trapped. This makes the painting psychologically richer and more frightening. A purely evil figure can be rejected from a safe distance, but Saturn's madness feels rooted in something recognizably human. Fear of agging, fear of being replaced, fear of losing power, fear that what comes after us will erase us. Goya seems to understand that these fears, when carried to their most extreme form, can become destructive not only to others, but to everything one claims to protect. Saturn destroys his own line in order to preserve himself, and in doing so he reveals the self-defeating logic of deceiving authority. The body language intensifies that logic. Saturn does not hold the child with tenderness distorted into cruelty. He grips the body with the force of possession and panic. The act feels hurried, almost frantic, as if he is trying to consume the evidence of time before it can fully appear. The child's body is already broken, reduced to flesh and blood. This is one of the most painful aspects of the image. Goya does not allow myth to remain abstract. He makes the victim real enough to disturb, but not individualized enough to become merely narrative. The child becomes innocence, helplessness, youth, and vulnerability all at once. That universality matters. If the painting worked only as a literal illustration of one myth, it would still be memorable, but it would not feel so immense. What gives it lasting force is that viewers can sense multiple meanings at once. It can be seen as a father destroying a son. It can be seen as old age devouring youth. It can be seen as time-consuming life. It can be seen as tyranny destroying the next generation. It can be seen as fear turning love into violence. None of these meanings cancel the others. They build upon one another and make the painting feel deeper each time it is viewed. The style of the work is crucial to this effect. Goya does not paint with polished classical refinement. The brushwork feels urgent, rough, and stripped down. Forms emerge from darkness with a kind of instability that makes them feel alive in the worst possible way. The surface of the painting seems close to collapse, as if the image itself has been dragged out of a troubled mind without the smoothing filters of academic perfection. This roughness is not a technical weakness. It is a form of truth. A painting about devouring fear would lose much of its power if it were too elegant. The darkness surrounding Saturn is equally important. It is not a neutral background. It feels like a void, a realm without order or rescue. There is no palace, no mountain, no mythical landscape to locate the scene in an ancient legendary world. Goya removes almost everything except body, blood, fear, and blackness. This choice makes the painting feel timeless and internal. It happens nowhere and everywhere. It happens in myth, but it also happens in the mind. The darkness turns the act into a psychological revelation rather than a historical episode. This is one reason the black paintings as a whole continue to fascinate viewers. They do not behave like traditional public masterpieces. They feel private, inward, and haunted. Goya was not painting them for applause or for royal favor. He painted them onto the walls of his home, surrounding himself with visions of dread, distortion, old age, and irrationality. That setting matters because it suggests that Saturn Devouring His Son belongs to a space of personal confrontation. It is less a lesson offered to society than a darkness lived beside. That intimacy makes it more disturbing. It is also impossible to separate the painting entirely from Goya's historical world. He had witnessed the cruelty of war, the brutality of political repression, and the failures of human reason. His art, especially in later life, is filled with a sense that civilization is thinner than it intends to be. Beneath laws, ceremonies, religion, and culture, violence and madness remain frighteningly close. In that context, Saturn can also be read politically. He becomes the image of any regime, ruler, institution, or generation, so afraid of losing control that it destroys those who come after it. The myth opens into history. At the same time, the painting's emotional force goes beyond politics. It touches something almost existential. To live is to move through time. To move through time is to be changed, diminished, replaced, and eventually ended. Saturn's act can therefore be felt as a nightmare version of the truth every human being tries not to dwell on. Time gives life, and time takes it away. Creation and destruction are entangled. The parent produces the child, but the larger order of existence consumes them both. Goya compresses all of that into one unbearable image. That is why the painting still shocks people who know nothing about classical mythology. They do not need the full story in order to feel its truth. The image works before explanation. It reaches the nervous system first. Only later does interpretation arrive, and when it does arrive, it discovers that the painting is even darker than it first seemed. This is not merely grotesque fantasy. It is a meditation on fear, age, power, time, and the devouring nature of existence itself. In that sense, Saturn, Devouring His Son, is far more than a mythological painting. It is one of the most terrifying psychological images ever created. Goya takes an ancient story and transforms it into a vision so raw and universal that it feels less like a retelling and more like a direct encounter with the darkest instincts of life and history. The lasting power of Saturn Devouring His Son comes from the fact that it never remains only a mythological image. It begins with an ancient story, but what the viewer feels in front of it is much larger than mythology. The painting talks about fear, power, aging, violence, and the terror of being replaced. It talks about time itself. It talks about the human tendency to destroy what feels threatening, even when that threat is also part of our own future. That is why the painting still feels so alive and so disturbing. It is not locked in the ancient world. It continues to describe modern anxieties with terrifying precision. One reason the work remains so unforgettable is that Goya refuses to make Saturn majestic. In many older treatments of gods, from classical mythology, divinity brings a certain grandeur. Even when the subject is violent, the figure may remain noble in posture, beautiful in anatomy, or elevated by the traditions of high art. Goya tears all of that away. His Saturn is not a glorious god. He is a haunted, ravenous, collapsing being. This choice matters because it transforms the myth from something distant and elevated into something immediate and humanly terrifying. The painting does not invite admiration of a deity. It forces a confrontation with madness. That loss of grandeur is central to the meaning of the work. Saturn is powerful, but it does not look secure. He looks panicked. He is committing the most extreme act of control imaginable, yet the act reveals that he has already lost control inwardly. The figure becomes a paradox. He devours in order to preserve his power, but the very need to devour proves that his power is already unstable. This is why the painting can be read so forcefully as an image of tyranny. Tyranny often appears stronger when it is actually most afraid. It lashes out not from confidence, but from dread. Goya captures that truth in a single monstrous body. This is one reason the painting has so often been interpreted politically. Viewers have seen in Saturn the image of rulers, states, or systems that consume their own people in order to survive. A regime destroys its youth. A nation sacrifices its children to war. A ruling generation crushes the one that comes after it. Institutions preserve themselves by devouring the very lives they claim to protect. These readings are powerful because they do not feel imposed on the painting. They emerge naturally from it. The devouring father becomes a symbol of any power that would rather destroy the future than risk losing authority over it. At the same time, the work reaches beyond politics into something even more elemental. The title itself invites a broader meditation because Saturn has long been associated with time. In that sense, the painting becomes one of the bleakest images ever made of time's power over life. Time creates. Time ages. Time erodes. Time takes back what it has allowed to exist. The child in the painting can therefore be understood not only as a literal son, but as youth, possibility, and life itself. Saturn becomes the force that consumes all beginning. That reading helps explain why the image feels so universal. Even without myth, every viewer knows that something in life is always being taken away. And yet the painting is not memorable only because of its symbolism. It is memorable because of how physically immediate it remains. The staring eyes, the tense grip, the mutilated body, the darkness around it all. None of these things allow the work to become a cool, intellectual allegory. Goya insists on embodiment. The horror must be seen in flesh. That is why the painting continues to affect people so strongly in museums, books, and reproductions. It does not stay at the level of idea. It strikes the body before the mind has fully organized its response. The painting is interpreted after it is felt. This emotional immediacy is one of the reasons modern viewers often experience the work as strangely contemporary. In many ways, Goya seems to anticipate modern psychology, modern horror, and modern disillusionment. He does not present the world as ordered by stable ideals. He shows the irrational beneath the surface. He understands that terror can come from within as much as from outside. He understands that violence is often born from fear. These are profoundly modern insights, and they help explain why his late work feels so close to later traditions of expressionism, nightmare imagery, and psychological art. The fact that Saturn Devouring His Son originally existed as a wall painting inside Goya's home deepens this modern feeling. It suggests that the image was part of an environment of private obsession rather than public performance. Viewers often sense that they are not simply looking at a polished masterpiece created for reputation. They are encountering something darker and more necessary. The painting feels like a confrontation with what could not be politely said. It belongs to the private theater of dread. That intimacy gives it a strange authenticity. It feels less designed than exercised. Another reason the work is hardened is that it refuses comfort. There is no visible rescue, no sign of divine justice intervening, no clear moral balance restored within the image. In the myth, of course, Satan is eventually defeated, but Goya doesn't paint that part. He chooses the moment of devouring. He chooses the victory of fear before the story can heal itself. That choice is crucial. It makes the painting feel suspended in a nightmare present, where all the viewer can do is witness the act. There is no narrative relief inside the frame. Only outside knowledge tells us the cycle will continue. Inside the image, terror rules. Absolutely. This refusal of comfort is part of what makes the painting so honest. Human beings often want art to reassure, to organize chaos, to transform suffering into beauty that can be safely admired. Goya does not entirely allow that here. The painting is great art, but it does not soften its own violence into elegance. It remains ugly in the deepest sense, not visually incompetent, but morally and psychologically unbearable. That refusal is part of its greatness. It gives to show that some truths are not meant to be and still, despite all its darkness, the painting has a strange clarity. It exposes what fear can do when fear becomes absolute. It exposes the madness of power trying to stop time. It exposes the tragedy of destruction turned against one's own future. This clarity is why the image remains relevant. Every age produces new forms of Saturn. Every era finds its own ways of devouring youth, possibility, and succession. Every generation faces powers that would rather consume what is coming than accept change. Goya's painting survives because it names that impulse in unforgettable form. That is why Saturn Devouring His Son remains one of the most disturbing and greatest paintings ever made. Not simply because it shocks, not simply because it is violent, but because it transforms myth into a vision of fear so deep that it touches politics, psychology, time, and human existence all at once. It makes visible a truth that many systems of power try to hide, that what appears strongest may in fact be most afraid, and that fear can become most monstrous when it turns against its own future. Once seen, the image does not leave quietly. The eyes remain, the darkness remains, the act remains. Goya created not just a mythological scene, but a permanent nightmare about power and time, and that is the final achievement of the painting. It does not merely show a god consuming a child. It shows what happens when fear decides its survival matters more than love, more than the future, more than life itself.